3 months after returning to Denver, Marcus Thompson sat in his small apartment staring at his laptop screen. The video of his arrest at Buckingham Palace had indeed gone viral, but not in the way he had originally hoped. It had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, but the comments were overwhelmingly critical. People called him an ugly American, a disrespectful tourist, and worse. What surprised him most was how the experience had changed his entire relationship. With social media, his follower count had actually increased dramatically due to the viral video, but Marcus found himself posting less and less. The attention felt hollow now, especially when he remembered the meaningful conversations he had shared with the veterans. In London, his phone buzzed with a notification, another comment on the arrest video, which still circulated regularly despite his attempts to move past it. Marcus had stopped reading most of them months ago, but this one caught his attention because it came from an account called British Vet 1995. I served with the Coldstream Guards for 6 years. What you did was wrong, but I've seen your recent posts about veteran support. Actions matter more than words. Keep doing better. Marcus smiled slightly. Over the past few months, he had been using his platform differently. Instead of pranks and stunts, he had been sharing stories about veterans, issues, military history, and the importance of cultural respect when traveling. His engagement rates had dropped significantly. Apparently, educational content wasn't as entertaining as watching someone get arrested, but the interactions felt more meaningful. His laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Sarah Williams, his solicitor from London, appeared on the screen with a professional smile. "Hello, Marcus. I have some news for you that I thought you'd want to hear personally." Marcus straightened in his chair. He had completed all the requirements of his sentence months ago, but Sarah had stayed in touch to update him on any developments in his case. "I've just received word from the Ministry of Defense," Sarah continued. "Your letter of apology was delivered to Guardsman Hayes, and he has chosen to respond." Marcus's heart rate increased. He had often wondered if his apology had meant anything to the guard he had disrespected, but he had never expected to hear back. Sarah held up an official-looking document. "With his permission, I'm going to read you his response. Mr. Thompson, I received your letter of apology and wanted to acknowledge its receipt. While your actions on that day were unacceptable, I have been informed of your community service work and your subsequent efforts to educate others about military service and respect. True character is shown not in our mistakes, but in how we choose to learn from them. I hope your experience has helped you become a better ambassador for your country when you travel abroad. Respectfully, Guardsman W. Hayes, Coldstream Guards." Marcus felt his eyes water as Sarah finished reading. The formal but gracious tone of the response meant more to him than any social media comment or like ever had. "There's more," Sarah said. "The Veterans Center where you completed your community service has requested permission to share your story as part of their educational outreach program. They want to use it as an example of how understanding and growth can come from even the most difficult situations." Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed since that day in London. His job at the marketing company had been understanding about his legal troubles, partly because his boss appreciated the lesson in cultural sensitivity it had provided. His colleagues now often consulted him when they were planning international campaigns. His relationship with his parents had actually grown stronger. The crisis in London had shown them a side of their son they hadn't seen before. His ability to take responsibility, learn from mistakes, and work toward genuine redemption. His mother had even started following his new social media content and sharing his posts about veteran support with her friends. Most significantly, Marcus had decided to change his career path entirely. He was now enrolled in night classes studying international relations and cultural studies, with a goal of working in cultural exchange programs. The idea of helping other Americans understand and respect foreign cultures had become more than just a way to make up for his past mistakes. It had become a genuine passion. 6 months after his return from London, Marcus received an unexpected email from the British Embassy in Washington. They were organizing a cultural sensitivity seminar for American students planning to study abroad, and they wanted to invite him to speak about his experience. The irony wasn't lost on him. The person who had become a symbol of American tourist ignorance was now being asked to help prevent others from making similar mistakes. Standing in front of the group of eager college students, Marcus began his presentation with the same video that had made him internet famous for all the wrong reasons. The students laughed at first, but their expressions grew more serious as Marcus explained the real consequences of his actions. "I thought I was being funny," he told them, "but I was actually being ignorant and disrespectful. I learned that when you travel to another country, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing all Americans. Every interaction you have shapes how people view our country and our values." One student raised her hand. "Do you regret making the video?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I regret the way I behaved and the disrespect I showed, but I don't regret what happened afterward because it taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. That experience in London, including my time in jail and working with veterans, changed my entire perspective on life." He clicked to his final slide, which showed a photo from his last day at the Veterans Center. He was standing next to Robert, the veteran who had lost his leg in Northern Ireland, both of them smiling genuinely at the camera. "The biggest lesson I learned is that every person has a story, a purpose, and a dignity that deserves respect, whether it's a guard at Buckingham Palace or a homeless veteran, or someone from a culture different from your own. Everyone deserves to be treated with basic human respect." After his presentation, several students approached Marcus with questions about travel, cultural differences, and social media responsibility. One young man asked, "Do you still use social media?" "I do," Marcus replied, "but differently now. Instead of trying to get attention by being disrespectful or outrageous, I try to use it to educate people and share stories that matter. I learned that real influence comes from making a positive impact, not just getting views." As Marcus drove home that evening, he thought about Guardsman William Hayes, still standing guard at Buckingham Palace with dignity and professionalism. He thought about the veterans he had worked with in London, who had shown him what real service looked like. He thought about the students he had just spoken to, who would hopefully travel with more awareness and respect than he had shown. The viral video of his arrest would probably follow him for the rest of his life. But Marcus had learned to see it differently. It was no longer just a record of his worst moment. It had become the starting point for his best decisions. Sometimes, he reflected, the most embarrassing failures can become the foundation for the most meaningful success. His phone buzzed with a notification from his latest social media post, a tribute to military service members on Veterans Day. Instead of millions of views and mockery, this post had received hundreds of thoughtful comments from veterans, military families, and people who appreciated his message of respect and gratitude. Marcus smiled as he pulled into his driveway. He had finally learned the difference between being noticed and making a difference, and that difference had made all the difference in the world. The Westminster Magistrates Court was an imposing building that made Marcus feel even smaller than he already did. As he sat in the defendant's dock, wearing the same clothes he had been arrested in the day before, he could feel the weight of the legal system pressing down on him. The courtroom was smaller than he had expected from movies, but somehow more intimidating because of its intimate atmosphere. Magistrate Eleanor Richardson was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through any pretense. She had been handling cases like this for over 20 years and had developed a reputation for being fair but firm, especially with tourists who showed disrespect to British institutions. "Marcus James Thompson," the clerk announced, reading from the charge sheet. "You are charged with assault, disturbing the peace, and interference with Crown duties. How do you plead?" Sarah Williams stood beside Marcus and whispered, "Remember what we discussed?" Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Magistrate Richardson looked up from her papers, studying Marcus carefully. "Mr. Thompson, do you understand the seriousness of these charges and what your guilty plea means?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I understand that I was disrespectful and inappropriate. I interfered with the guard's duties, and I take full responsibility for my actions." The magistrate made a note and then addressed the prosecution. Officer Mitchell, please present the facts of the case. Officer Mitchell stood and gave a clear, professional account of the previous day's events. He described Marcus's escalating behavior, the multiple warnings from bystanders that were ignored, and the ultimate physical contact that led to the arrest. Several tourists had provided witness statements, and some had even shared their video recordings with the police. The defendant showed a complete disregard for British law and customs. Officer Mitchell concluded, his behavior was not only illegal, but deeply disrespectful to one of our most honored traditions and to a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Sarah Williams then stood to present Marcus's mitigation. Your Honor, my client is a 28-year-old marketing professional from Denver, Colorado. He has no previous criminal record and comes from a respectable family. While his actions were clearly inappropriate, they stemmed from cultural ignorance rather than malicious intent. She paused and looked at Marcus encouragingly. Mr. Thompson has spent the last 24 hours reflecting on his behavior and has come to understand the gravity of his actions. He wishes to express his sincere remorse to the court and to the guard he disrespected. Magistrate Richardson nodded and then addressed Marcus directly. Mr. Thompson, you have the opportunity to speak on your own behalf. What would you like to say? Marcus stood slowly, his legs feeling unsteady. He had rehearsed this moment with Sarah, but now that it was happening, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. Your Honor, he began, his voice stronger than he felt. I want to apologize not just to this court, but to Guardsman Hayes, to the other tourists whose experience I disrupted, and to the British people whose traditions I disrespected. He took a deep breath and continued. I came to London as a tourist, but I behaved like an ignorant fool. I treated a professional soldier like he was a prop for my social media content. I ignored warnings from other people because I was too focused on getting attention online. Marcus felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he pushed through. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, and I realized that I wasn't just being disrespectful to one person. I was disrespecting your entire country and your history. The guards at Buckingham Palace represent something important and sacred, and I treated it like a joke. The courtroom was completely silent as Marcus finished. I know saying sorry doesn't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I truly understand now how wrong I was. I've learned more about respect and dignity in the last day than I had in years. Magistrate Richardson listened carefully, occasionally making notes. When Marcus sat down, she spent several minutes reviewing the files in front of her. Mr. Thompson, she said finally, your actions yesterday were indeed serious. The Queen's Guard are not tourist attractions. They are serving members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces performing an important ceremonial and security function. Your behavior showed not only disrespect for British institutions, but also a troubling lack of consideration for others. Marcus's heart sank as he heard the criticism, but the magistrate continued. However, I am encouraged by your apparent genuine remorse and your willingness to accept responsibility for your actions. Your solicitor is correct that cultural ignorance, while not an excuse, can be considered in mitigation. She looked directly at Marcus. I am going to impose a sentence that I believe fits both the seriousness of your offense and your expressed commitment to learning from this experience. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Magistrate Richardson consulted her notes one final time. You are sentenced to pay a fine of $500 plus court costs of $150. Additionally, you will perform 20 hours of community service to be completed before you leave the United Kingdom. This community service will be arranged through the Veterans Assistance Program, where you will work directly with former military personnel. Marcus felt a wave of relief, mixed with continued anxiety. Thank you, Your Honor. When will I be able to return to the United States? That depends on how quickly you complete your community service, she replied. You are also required to write a formal letter of apology to Guardsman Hayes, which will be delivered through official channels. Finally, I am issuing a restraining order that prohibits you from approaching within 100 meters of any royal residence or ceremonial guard post for the remainder of your time in the United Kingdom. Marcus nodded quickly. I understand, Your Honor. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to make things right. Do not mistake this for leniency, Mr. Thompson, Magistrate Richardson said sternly. This sentence is designed to educate you and ensure you understand the impact of your actions. If you fail to complete any part of it, or if you are arrested again while in the UK, you will face much more serious consequences. As the court session ended, Sarah Williams walked Marcus through the practical details of his sentence. The fine would need to be paid within 48 hours. The community service would begin the next day at a veterans center in South London, where he would work alongside former soldiers who had served in conflicts around the world. This is actually an opportunity, Sarah explained as they left the courthouse. The veterans you'll be working with have incredible stories and perspectives. If you approach this with the right attitude, you might learn things that change how you see the world. Outside the courthouse, Marcus felt the London air differently than he had 2 days earlier. The city looked the same, but his perspective had shifted dramatically. He was no longer a carefree tourist collecting experiences for social media. He was someone who had made a serious mistake and was now working to understand and repair the damage he had caused. That evening, back in his hotel room, Marcus sat down to write the letter of apology to Guardsman Hayes. He went through multiple drafts, trying to find words that conveyed his genuine remorse without sounding like he was making excuses. The final version was simple and direct. Dear Guardsman Hayes, I am writing to apologize for my inexcusable behavior at Buckingham Palace. I treated you with disrespect and ignorance, failing to recognize your service and professionalism. I understand. Now that you were not just doing a job but honoring a tradition and serving your country with dignity, I am deeply sorry for my actions and grateful for the lesson you taught me about respect and consequences. I hope that my behavior will not reflect poorly on other American visitors to your country. With sincere regret, Marcus Thompson. The next morning, Marcus reported to the South London Veterans Center, a modest building that served former military personnel who were struggling with various challenges after their service. The center's director, Margaret Collins, was a former Army nurse who had seen the effects of war firsthand. Mr. Thompson, she said, looking him over carefully, I understand you're here because you disrespected one of our guardsmen. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am, Marcus replied, feeling ashamed all over again. I made a terrible mistake and I want to do whatever I can to make up for it. Margaret nodded slowly. Well, you'll be working with some of our residents who have given far more to this country than you can probably imagine. I suggest you listen more than you talk and try to understand what service and sacrifice really mean. Over the next 3 days, Marcus worked alongside veterans from conflicts spanning decades. There was Robert, who had lost his leg in Northern Ireland and now struggled with unemployment. There was Janet, a former RAF pilot who battled PTSD after her tours in Afghanistan. There was David, a Falklands veteran who had been homeless for 2 years before finding help at the center. Each person had a story that humbled Marcus and made him understand the depth of his ignorance about military service. These weren't characters in his social media story. They were real people who had sacrificed for their country and were now dealing with the long-term consequences of that service. The guards you mock. The Paddington Green police station was nothing like what Marcus had expected from watching crime shows on television. The fluorescent lights were harsh and unflattering. The walls were a depressing shade of beige, and the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with stale coffee filled the air. As Officer Mitchell led him through the booking process, Marcus felt each step taking him further from his comfortable American reality. Empty your pockets completely, the desk sergeant instructed, sliding a plastic tray across the counter. Marcus complied with shaking hands, placing his wallet, passport, hotel keycard, and various tourist trinkets into the container. When he hesitated before adding his phone, the sergeant's expression made it clear this wasn't optional. How long do I have to stay here? Marcus asked as they took his fingerprints. The ink felt cold and somehow permanent on his fingers, like he was being marked in a way that would never fully wash off. That depends on several factors, Officer Mitchell explained patiently. The magistrate will review your case, probably tomorrow morning. Until then, you'll be held here. The word held hit Marcus like a physical blow. He wasn't just in trouble, he was actually in jail, in a foreign country, for touching someone's face. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't happening to him. They photographed him from multiple angles, the camera flash leaving spots in his vision. The booking officer, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, asked him standard questions about his health, emergency contacts, and previous arrests. Previous arrests? Marcus repeated. I've never even had a speeding ticket. This is all a huge mistake. The officer made a note on her form without commenting. She had clearly heard similar protests many times before. When they led him to his cell, Marcus felt his last bit of bravado finally crumble completely. The space was small, clean, and absolutely nothing like his hotel room. A narrow bench served as both seat and bed, with a thin mattress and scratchy blanket. The toilet was stainless steel and completely exposed. There was one small window, too high to look out of, that let in a depressing amount of gray London light. Someone will bring you dinner in a few hours, Officer Mitchell said as he closed the cell door. The sound of the lock engaging seemed to echo louder than it should have. Try to get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Alone for the first time since his arrest, Marcus sat on the bench and tried to process what had happened. 6 hours ago, he had been a carefree tourist making content for his social media followers. Now he was sitting in a London jail cell, facing charges he didn't fully understand, with no clear idea of when he would be released. He thought about his followers and wondered what was happening to his accounts. The live stream had ended abruptly when they confiscated his phone, probably right at the most dramatic moment. Were people sharing the video? Were they laughing at him or feeling sorry for him? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing it. Would be bad. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything substantial since the airplane snacks that morning. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had been waving chips in front of a guard's face just hours ago, and now he was the one who was hungry and unable to get food when he wanted it. As evening approached, another officer brought him a meal tray, some kind of stew, bread, and tea. The food was bland but edible, and Marcus found himself grateful for it despite everything. The simple act of eating made him feel slightly more human. Any chance I could call my parents? He asked the officer, who collected his empty tray. You'll get your phone call tomorrow before you see the magistrate, she replied. Try to think about who you want to contact and what you want to tell them. That night, lying on the uncomfortable mattress and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a British police station, Marcus had plenty of time to think. He thought about his parents back in Denver who had been so proud of their son taking his first solo trip to Europe. He thought about his job at the marketing company and whether they would fire him for being arrested overseas. He thought about his friends who had encouraged his social media antics and would probably find his situation hilarious until they realized how serious it really was. Most of all, he thought about Guardsman William Hayes, standing at his post, with dignity and professionalism while Marcus had treated him like a prop in a comedy sketch. For the first time, Marcus began to understand that the guard wasn't just a tourist attraction. He was a real person doing a real job, with feelings and pride and a duty to perform. The next morning came too early and too late at the same time. Marcus had dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to the reality of his situation. When they brought him breakfast, eggs, beans, toast, and more tea, he ate mechanically, his mind focused on the phone call he would soon be allowed to make. Thompson, Marcus Thompson, the desk sergeant called. Time for your call. Marcus was escorted to a phone booth that looked like it belonged in a museum. His hands shook as he dialed his parents' number, calculating the time difference and hoping someone would be awake. Mom, he said when he heard his mother's familiar voice. Marcus, how's London? Are you having a wonderful time? The cheerful enthusiasm in her voice made what he had to say even harder. Mom, I need you to sit down. I'm in some trouble here. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. When his mother finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. What kind of trouble, honey? Marcus explained the situation as best he could, trying to minimize the worst parts while still conveying the seriousness. His mother's shock and disappointment came through clearly even across the Atlantic Ocean. We'll figure this out, she said finally, though her voice was shaky. Your father and I will contact the American embassy. We'll get you a lawyer. Just try to stay calm and be respectful to everyone there. After the call ended, Marcus was taken to a small interview room where a duty solicitor was waiting, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor who introduced herself as Sarah Williams. "I've reviewed your case," she said, opening a file folder. "The charges are serious, but not uncommon for tourist-related incidents. The key will be showing genuine remorse and understanding of why your actions were inappropriate." "I do understand," Marcus said quickly. I'm starting to understand. I never meant to disrespect anyone or cause trouble." Sarah studied him carefully. "That's a good start. But you need to understand that intent matters less than impact here. Your actions affected not just the guard but the integrity of an important British institution. The magistrate will want to see that you truly grasp the significance of what you did." As they prepared for his appearance before the magistrate, Marcus realized that his European vacation had become something entirely different from what he had planned. Instead of collecting experiences and content for social media, he was learning hard lessons about respect, consequences, and the difference between entertainment and real life. The moment Marcus's finger made contact with William's cheek, everything changed in an instant. The guardsman's reaction was swift, precise, and completely professional. Without breaking his military bearing or losing his composure, William turned, his head slightly, and spoke in a voice that cut through the crowd noise like a knife. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The command was delivered with such authority and volume that several tourists jumped backward instinctively. Marcus, however, was so shocked that someone had actually spoken that he stumbled and nearly dropped his phone. His mouth fell open as he stared at William, who had returned to his original position but whose eyes were now locked directly on the American tourist. The crowd around them erupted in whispers and exclamations. Camera phones that had been recording Marcus's antics were now capturing his stunned reaction. The teenage girl from Spain giggled nervously. The elderly British gentleman who had tried to warn Marcus earlier shook his head with a satisfied expression. Did you just talk?" Marcus stammered, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. For the first time since arriving at the palace, he looked genuinely uncertain. His camera was still recording, but he seemed to have forgotten about his audience entirely. Officer Mitchell stepped forward, his police uniform and serious expression immediately commanding attention. "Sir, I need you to step away from the guard and come with me," he said firmly. His tone was professional but left no room for argument. Marcus looked around frantically, as if suddenly realizing that he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. Wait, he said, holding up his free hand while keeping his phone trained on the scene. "This is just for social media. I'm not doing anything illegal. I barely touched the guy." "Sir," Officer Mitchell repeated, moving closer. "You need to put the phone down and step away from the guard immediately. You've interfered with a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces in the execution of his duties." The legal language seemed to hit Marcus like a cold splash of water. "Interfered? I was just making a video. This is public property, right? I have rights as an American citizen." Sergeant Major Davidson approached from behind, his years of military authority evident in every step. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute command. "This is Crown property, son, and you've just assaulted a British soldier. Your American citizenship doesn't give you the right to disrespect our institutions or our personnel." Marcus's face went pale. The word assault seemed to echo in his mind. "Assault? I didn't assault anyone. I just touched his face for like half a second." "Under British law," Officer Mitchell explained while pulling out his handcuffs, "any unwanted physical contact constitutes assault. You were repeatedly warned to maintain distance and chose to ignore those warnings. Additionally, you've created a public disturbance and interfered with military duties." The crowd around them had grown significantly. What had started as maybe 20 curious tourists was now at least 50 people, all watching as Marcus's social media stunt transformed into a very real legal situation. Some were still recording, but the mood had shifted from amusement to serious concern. Marcus finally lowered his phone, his hands beginning to shake slightly. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't know. I thought it was all just for show. Can't we just forget this happened?" William remained at his post, having returned to his original stance and expression. But now there was something different about his presence. A sense of vindicated dignity. He had handled the situation exactly as his training required, with minimal force but maximum effectiveness. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way," Officer Mitchell said, moving behind Marcus. "You're under arrest for assault, disturbing the peace, and interference with Crown duties. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say may be used against you in court." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Marcus seemed to fully grasp the severity of his situation for the first time. "This is insane," he protested, his voice cracking slightly. "People do this stuff all the time. It's all over YouTube. I'm just a tourist." Sergeant Major Davidson stepped closer, his expression stern but not unkind. "Son, being a tourist doesn't exempt you from following our laws or showing basic respect. These guards are serving soldiers who have fought for Queen and country. They deserve better than to be treated as entertainment." The crowd began to disperse as Officer Mitchell guided Marcus toward a waiting police vehicle. But not everyone left. Several tourists continued recording, and Marcus could hear fragments of conversation in multiple languages. Words like disrespectful, inappropriate, and deserved it were being repeated in English, German, French, and Spanish. As they walked, Marcus's initial shock began wearing off, replaced by a growing panic about the implications. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked Officer Mitchell. "I mean, this is just a misunderstanding. Can't you just give me a warning or something?" "That's not my decision to make," the officer replied. "You'll be processed at the station, and then it will be up to the magistrate to determine appropriate charges and penalties." Marcus's mind raced as he thought about his return flight to Denver, scheduled for 3 days later. "I'm supposed to fly home on Tuesday. This isn't going to mess up my flight, is it?" Officer Mitchell glanced at him with something that might have been sympathy. "I'd suggest you contact your embassy and probably a solicitor. This could take some time to sort out." The police car was now in sight, and Marcus could see other tourists pointing and whispering as he was led past them. His phone, still clutched in his cuffed hands, showed dozens of notifications from his live stream. Comments, shares, and tags that were probably not the kind of viral fame he had been hoping for. "My followers," he said suddenly, as if remembering they existed. "They saw everything. They know I didn't mean any harm." Sergeant Major Davidson, who had been walking alongside them, spoke up. "Your followers also saw you ignore multiple warnings, disrespect a serving soldier, and physically assault a member of Her Majesty's Guard. I doubt that's going to help your case." As they reached the police car, Marcus turned back toward the palace gates where William continued standing guard, professional and dignified as ever. The contrast between the soldier's composed bearing and his own situation couldn't have been more stark. "I just wanted to make a good video," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in completely. His European vacation had just become a legal nightmare, and his moment of social media ambition had turned into the worst decision of his life. Officer Mitchell opened the car door and guided Marcus inside. As they drove away from Buckingham Palace, Marcus could see tourists still gathering around the gates, probably talking about what they had just witnessed. He realized that he had indeed become famous, but not at all in the way he had intended. Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out a small bag of chips he had bought at the airport. The crinkle of the plastic wrapper seemed unusually loud in the tense atmosphere that had developed around the palace gates. He opened the bag, with an exaggerated flourish, making sure his phone camera captured every moment. "Okay, followers, let's test this theory," he announced, his voice getting louder and more obnoxious with each word. "If this guy is really a professional soldier like everyone claims, he should be able to handle a little snack time, right?" The tourists around them had formed an unofficial circle, some still taking pictures, but most now watching with growing concern. A middle-aged woman from Australia leaned over to her husband. "This isn't right," she whispered. "Someone should stop him." Her husband nodded grimly. "I think someone will. Very soon." Marcus held up a chip in front of William's face, waving it back and forth like he was trying to tempt a pet. "Come on, buddy. You must be hungry standing out here all day. Just one little bite? No? Not even a nibble? He laughed at his own performance, checking his phone to see the live viewer count climbing higher than it had ever been. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his peripheral vision, he could see his commanding officer, Sergeant Major Davidson, approaching from the guardroom. The Sergeant Major was a 20-year veteran who had seen everything and tolerated very little. His presence meant the situation was being monitored at the highest levels, but Marcus was oblivious to these developments. He was too caught up in what he perceived as his moment of internet fame. He moved the chip closer to William's face, almost touching the guard's cheek. With it, "Maybe he's on some kind of special diet," Marcus said to his camera. "You know, the royal diet. Only the finest foods for the Queen's personal action figures." He crunched loudly on the chip himself, chewing with his mouth open deliberately, close to William's ear. A security guard from the Metropolitan Police had also noticed the commotion and was making his way through the crowd. Officer James Mitchell had been working Royal Protection Detail for 5 years and had developed a sixth sense for trouble. The American tourist's behavior had crossed several lines already, and it was clear he had no intention of stopping. Marcus finished his theatrical chip-eating display and stuffed the empty bag back into his pocket, but instead of backing away, he moved even closer to William. Now he was less than 6 inches from the guard's face, well within what any reasonable person would consider personal space. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, speaking directly, to William now instead of just to his camera. "I think you guys are all fake. I think this whole thing is just for show. I bet underneath that fancy uniform you're just another British guy who drinks tea and says cheerio all the time." Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. A teenage girl from Spain grabbed her father's arm. "Papa, this isn't good," she whispered in English, having learned the language well enough to understand the severity of Marcus's words. William's breathing remained steady and controlled, but his eyes had sharpened. In his military training, he had learned to recognize escalating threats, and this tourist was displaying classic signs of someone building up to physical contact. The verbal disrespect was bad enough, but William could sense something more dangerous coming. Marcus stepped back slightly and made a show of examining William from head to toe, narrating his observations to his phone camera like he was David Attenborough studying wildlife. "Look at this specimen," he said with mock seriousness, standing at approximately 6 feet tall, wearing what appears to be a Halloween costume from the 1800s. Notice the complete lack of expression, the vacant stare, the total absence of human personality. Truly fascinating. Officer Mitchell had worked his way to the front of the crowd and was now positioned about 10 feet away from Marcus, close enough to intervene quickly if necessary. He spoke quietly into his radio, alerting other units to the developing situation. Marcus noticed the police officer and his eyes lit up with excitement rather than concern. "Oh, this is perfect," he said to his camera. "Now we've got the whole British authority parade here. A fake guard and a real cop. This is going to be my most viral video ever." He turned back to William with renewed energy. "You hear that, statue man? You're about to be famous. Thousands of people are watching this live, and millions more will. See it later. You're going to be the guard who couldn't handle one little American tourist." The sergeant major had now positioned himself at a strategic angle where he could see everything clearly. His experienced eye took in the scene. The disrespectful tourist, the growing crowd, the police presence, and most importantly, the subtle signs that Guardsman Hayes was reaching his limit. The sergeant major knew his men well, and he could read the micro-expressions that others might miss. Marcus decided it was time for his grand finale. He looked directly into his phone camera with the kind of grin that had annoyed teachers, bosses, and authority figures throughout his life. "All right, followers, it's time for the ultimate test. I'm going to do something that will either prove this guy is a real soldier or expose him as the fake I think he is. Either way, you're going to want to share this video with everyone you know." He reached out his hand toward William's face, not quite touching but coming close enough that several people in the crowd stepped forward instinctively. "I'm going to see if I can get any reaction at all from our British friend here. Maybe a little poke, maybe a little tap on that ridiculous hat." A woman's voice called out from the crowd, "Don't do it. You're going to get in serious trouble." But Marcus either didn't hear her or didn't care. William's training kicked into high gear. Every instinct he had developed through years of military service was now focused on the hand moving toward his face. His mind calculated angles, distances, and responses. The tourist had already violated multiple protocols, ignored numerous warnings from bystanders, and was now threatening physical contact. Marcus's fingertip was now less than an inch from William's cheek. The crowd held its collective breath. Officer Mitchell's hand moved toward his radio. The sergeant major took a step forward. "Here we go," Marcus whispered to his camera, his voice filled with anticipation. The moment of truth. But what Marcus didn't understand was that he had already crossed too many lines. What he saw as harmless fun, the professionals around him recognized as a serious security threat. The tourist thought he was making entertainment, but he was actually creating an incident that would have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. The next few seconds would change everything, not just for Marcus's social media presence, but for his entire European vacation and possibly his future travel plans. The guards of Buckingham Palace had protocols for dealing with threats, and those protocols were about to be demonstrated with swift and decisive action. Marcus Thompson stepped off the tour bus in front of Buckingham Palace, his camera already clicking away before his feet fully touched the London pavement. The 28-year-old American had been planning this European vacation for months, and London was supposed to be the crown jewel of his adventure. He wore his typical tourist uniform, cargo shorts despite the cool October weather, a bright red I Love NY t-shirt, and a baseball cap turned backwards. "This is going to be epic," he muttered to himself, scrolling through his phone to check how many likes his last Instagram post had gotten. Marcus wasn't just any tourist. He was what his friends back in Denver called an influencer wannabe. With his 15,000 followers on various social media platforms, he considered himself somewhat of a celebrity. Every trip, every meal, every moment was content waiting to happen. The palace stood majestically before him, its cream-colored stone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. Tourists from around the world crowded the gates, snapping photos and chatting excitedly in dozens of languages. But Marcus barely noticed the architecture or the history surrounding him. His eyes were focused on something else entirely: the two motionless figures standing guard at the entrance. The Queen's Guard stood at attention in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. Their faces were stern and expressionless, eyes fixed straight ahead as if they were looking through the crowd rather than at it. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active soldiers from elite British Army regiments trained to protect the royal family and maintain the dignity of the crown. Marcus had heard about these guards from other travelers. "They're like statues," one friend had told him. "You can do whatever you want and they won't react. It's hilarious." This was exactly the kind of content Marcus lived for, something that would get shares, comments, and maybe even go viral. He pushed through the crowd of respectful tourists, most of whom were keeping a reasonable distance from the guards and taking photos quietly. An elderly Japanese couple bowed slightly before taking their picture. A family from Germany whispered to their children about showing respect. But Marcus saw only an opportunity. Excuse me," he said loudly, shouldering past a group of French students. His voice carried an air of entitlement that made several people turn and frown. He pulled out his phone and switched it to video mode, checking his appearance in the front-facing camera before flipping it around. "What's up, followers?" he announced to his phone, speaking loud enough that nearby tourists started to stare. "Marcus here, live from Buckingham Palace in London, England. And I'm about to show you something absolutely insane. See these guards behind me? They're basically human robots. Watch this." The guard Marcus was approaching was Guardsman William Hayes, a 24-year-old soldier from the Coldstream Guards who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. William had been standing at his post for nearly an hour, maintaining perfect posture despite the growing crowd and increasingly disrespectful behavior from some tourists. He had dealt with plenty of inappropriate behavior before, people trying to make him laugh, touching his uniform, even attempting to tip his hat. But something about this particular tourist's energy felt different. Marcus positioned himself directly in front of William, barely 2 feet away. The proper distance, according to clearly posted signs, was at least 6 feet, But Marcus either didn't see the signs or didn't care. He held his phone up, making sure both he and the guard were in frame. "So check this out, guys," he said to his camera, his voice dripping with the kind of fake enthusiasm that had become his trademark. "This dude has to stand here all day and can't move, can't talk, can't do anything. It's like having a real-life action figure, but boring." Several tourists around them had stopped their own activities to watch Marcus's display. Some looked uncomfortable, whispering to each other in their native languages. Others pulled out their own phones, not to copy Marcus's behavior, but to document what they sensed might become an incident. William remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd, but inside, he was calculating. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, including dealing with disruptive tourists. The key was determining when someone crossed the line from merely annoying to actually threatening or interfering with his duties. Marcus stepped even closer, now barely a foot from the guard. "Look at this guy," he continued, speaking directly to his phone but loud enough for everyone around to hear. "I bet I could do jumping jacks right in front of him and he wouldn't even blink. These British soldiers are supposed to be so tough, but they're just dress-up dolls for tourists." An older British gentleman in a wool coat stepped forward. "Excuse me, young man," he said politely but firmly. "You're being quite disrespectful. Perhaps you should step back and show some proper courtesy." Marcus turned his camera toward the, man, grinning. "And here's a local trying to tell me what to do. Sorry, Grandpa, but this is content gold. My followers are eating this up." He glanced at his phone screen, where comments were indeed starting to pour in, though many of them were not as supportive as he had hoped. The British gentleman shook his head and walked away, muttering something about tourists these days. But his words had been heard by others in the crowd, and a subtle shift began to occur. The atmosphere changed from curious observation to uncomfortable tension. Marcus was too focused on his phone to notice. The comments were coming in fast now, and while some were the laughing emojis he had hoped for, others were telling him to stop, calling him disrespectful, even using words he didn't want to read. But the attention was what mattered. Good or bad, people were watching. He pocketed his phone for a moment and looked directly at William's face. The guard's expression hadn't changed even slightly, but something in his eyes suggested he was very much aware of what was happening. Marcus interpreted this as a challenge rather than a warning. "You know what?" Marcus said, pulling his phone back out and switching to a wider camera angle. "I don't think this guy is even real. I think he might be a statue. There's only one way to find out for sure." The crowd around them grew larger, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Some people had their phones out, others were looking around for security or police. A few families with small children began moving away, parents instinctively protecting their kids from whatever was coming next. William remained perfectly still, but every muscle in his body was now coiled and ready. His training kicked in as he assessed the situation, the crowd, and the increasingly aggressive behavior of the tourist in front of him. He had reached the point where action might soon be necessary.